Ana Rodriguez's fingers trembled as she stared at her phone screen, the glow illuminating her face in the dimly lit Los Angeles apartment. The text message she'd just sent felt like a time bomb. "We need to talk. I want to give us another chance." The words seemed to mock her from the screen, each letter carrying the weight of months of pain and unspoken trauma. She got up from her worn leather couch and paced the small living room, her bare feet silent against the carpet. The evening traffic outside her window created a steady hum, but she barely noticed it. Her mind was racing through memories of her relationship with Carlos Rivera, the good times that had become increasingly rare, the arguments that grew more frequent, and the subtle ways he'd stripped away her confidence over their 3 years together. The apartment felt smaller than usual tonight. Ana had spent weeks planning this moment, rehearsing what she'd say when she saw him again. The gun in her bedside drawer wasn't part of the original plan. She'd bought it after a particularly bad nightmare about Carlos showing up at her door uninvited, like he used to do when they were together. Just for protection, she'd told herself at the gun shop. Just in case. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. Carlos had replied. "Really? After everything? Where do you want to meet?" Ana's heart raced as she typed out the response, suggesting their old spot at Elysian Park. It was where they'd had their first date, watching the sunset over the city. Now it would be the perfect place for what she had planned, secluded enough at night, but not so isolated that she'd feel trapped. She walked to her bedroom and opened the drawer, looking at the gun. The metal felt cold and heavy in her hands as she checked it for the 3rd time that day. Ana had never imagined herself as someone who would own a gun, let alone bring one to meet an ex. But Carlos had changed her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Memories flooded back. The way he'd check her phone when she wasn't looking, how he'd make subtle comments about her weight until she stopped eating normally, the times he'd show up at her workplace unannounced to surprise her, really just checking up on her. Each incident seemed small on its own, but together they had carved away at her sense of self until she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. The sun was setting now, painting her apartment in shades of orange and purple. Ana walked to her closet and pulled out a dark hoodie, practical for the cool evening air, but also perfect for concealing the gun in its pocket. She caught her reflection in the mirror and paused, studying the face looking back at her. Her brown eyes seemed harder now, missing the spark that used to make Carlos call her his bright star. Her long black hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, no longer styled to his preferences. As she got ready, Ana thought about her best friend Maria's warnings. "He's just going to manipulate you again," Maria had said when Ana mentioned wanting closure. Some people never change. But Maria didn't understand. This wasn't about changing Carlos or getting him back. This was about ending something that should have been over long ago. Carlos texted again. "I'll be there in an hour. Looking forward to seeing you, mi amor." The old pet name made her stomach turn. He still thought he had power over her, could still sweet-talk his way back into her life. The familiar mix of anger and fear rose in her chest, but this time it felt different. This time, she had control. Ana grabbed her keys and the gun, tucking it carefully into her hoodie pocket. The weight of it against her side was both terrifying and reassuring. She took one last look around her apartment, wondering if everything would look different when she returned. The framed photos on her walls, mostly of family and friends, Carlos long since removed, seemed to watch her with judgment. The drive to Elysian Park felt surreal. Los Angeles traffic moved around her in its usual chaos, but Ana felt disconnected from it all, like she was watching herself from outside her body. She parked in the familiar spot near the trail entrance, where she and Carlos used to meet for their evening walks. The park was quieter now, with only a few joggers passing through, their reflective gear catching the last rays of sunlight. She checked her phone again. Carlos would be here soon. The park lamps were starting to come on, creating pools of yellow light along the path. Ana chose a spot just at the edge of one of these circles of light, visible enough to not seem suspicious, but dim enough to hide her expressions. As she waited, Ana remembered the last time she'd seen Carlos. It had been at a mutual friend's birthday party 3 months ago. He'd acted like nothing was wrong, chatting and laughing with their friends while she stood in the corner, feeling like she was suffocating. When he'd tried to hug her goodbye, she'd flinched away. The hurt look on his face had almost made her apologize, a reflex she was still trying to unlearn. The sound of tires on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. Carlos's black Honda pulled into the parking lot, and Anna's hand instinctively moved to her pocket. She watched him get out of the car, noting how familiar his movements still were to her. He was wearing the blue jacket she'd given him last Christmas, and the sight of it made her anger flare. How dare he wear that tonight? Carlos approached with that confident walk she used to love, now seeing it as the stride of someone who thought he owned every room he entered. His dark hair was shorter than when she'd last seen him, and he'd grown a neat beard that made him look more mature. He smiled when he saw her, that charming smile that had won her over 3 years ago at their mutual friend's barbecue. "Anna," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. "You look good." The compliment slid over her like oil, leaving her feeling dirty. "Thanks for coming," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of course. I've missed you, you know." He took a step closer, and Anna fought the urge to step back. "When I got your text, I couldn't believe it. I've been hoping you'd reach out." The familiar scent of his cologne reached her, and with it came a rush of memories, both good and bad. Movie nights on her couch, his arms around her. Arguments that ended with her apologizing for things that weren't her fault. The time he'd thrown her phone across the room because a male coworker had texted her about a project. "We need to talk," Anna said, her hand still in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the gun. "About everything that happened." Carlos's smile faltered slightly. "The past is the past, mi amor. We both made mistakes. But we can start fresh, right? That's why you wanted to meet." The dismissive tone in his voice, the same tone he'd used every time she tried to confront him about his behavior, made something snap inside her. All the practiced words, the careful plan to calmly confront him, evaporated. "Mistakes?" Her voice rose slightly. "Is that what you call what you did to me?" His expression changed, the charm dropping away to reveal something harder. "Keep your voice down," he said quietly, stepping closer. "What are you talking about? I never did anything to you." The argument escalated quickly, their voices carrying through the quiet park. Anna pulled out the gun, her hands shaking but her grip firm. Carlos's eyes widened, then narrowed. The last trace of his charm disappeared. "So this is what you really wanted?" he sneered. "To get me out here and threaten me? You're crazy, you know that." The word crazy, his favorite accusation whenever she'd confronted him about his behavior, echoed in her head. Before she realized what was happening, Carlos lunged for the gun. There was a struggle, a loud bang, and then silence. The park lamp buzzed overhead as Carlos collapsed. Anna stood frozen, the gun still in her hands, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. In the distance, she could hear someone shouting and the sound of running feet. But all she could focus on was Carlos, lying still on the ground, and the way the park lamp's glow reflected off the growing dark pool beneath him. The sound of sirens grew louder as Anna stood in the harsh glare of police flashlights. Her mind raced through all the moments that had led to this night. Every argument, every manipulative comment, every time she'd convinced herself things would get better. The weight of these memories pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. Around her, voices buzzed with activity. Someone was asking her questions, but she could barely focus on the words. All she could think about was how many other people had stood where she was now, confronting their own demons in the dark. How many had reached their breaking point, thinking they could face their past without letting it consume them. Officer Sarah Chin approached carefully, her voice steady and professional. "Ms. Rodriguez, I need you to put the weapon down slowly." The young officer had handled domestic cases before, but something about this scene felt different. The way the woman stood there, so still, clutching the gun like it was the only real thing in the world. Anna finally looked up, meeting Officer Chen's eyes. "I just wanted him to listen," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of emergency vehicles and radio chatter. All these years, he never really listened. The gun slipped from Anna's fingers, landing with a dull thud on the grass. As Officer Chin secured the weapon, other officers moved in to handcuff Anna. The cold metal against her wrists felt surreal, like this was happening to someone else. She watched as paramedics worked on Carlos, their movements becoming increasingly less urgent. She knew what that meant. Maria arrived at the police station just after midnight, her face pale with shock. She'd been the first person Anna had been allowed to call. "Oh, Anna," she said, pressing her hand against the glass partition. "What happened?" "I don't know anymore," Anna replied, her voice hollow. "I thought I could handle seeing him. I thought I was strong enough." She paused, studying her friend's worried face. "Would you have done anything different? If it was you?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable. Maria had watched their relationship deteriorate over the years, had seen the way Carlos slowly chipped away at Anna's confidence, her independence, her sense of self. She'd begged Anna to leave him countless times, but she'd never imagined it would end like this. Detective James Morgan sat across from Anna in the interrogation room, his weathered face impossible to read. "Walk me through it again," he said, clicking his pen. "From the beginning. Why did you really ask him to meet you?" Anna's court-appointed lawyer, David Torres, sat beside her, his presence both reassuring and terrifying. Everything she said now would matter. Every word would be analyzed, picked apart, used to determine the rest of her life. "I wanted closure," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "After everything he put me through, I thought if I could just make him understand what he did to me, maybe the nightmares would stop." "The nightmares?" Detective Morgan leaned forward slightly. Anna wrapped her arms around herself, a gesture that made her look younger than her 28 years. "I'd wake up thinking he was in my apartment. He used to do that, you know? Show up unannounced, saying he was checking on me. Even after we broke up, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might appear at any moment." David Torres watched his client carefully as she spoke. He'd handled domestic violence cases before, but they usually involved clear physical abuse. This was different. Years of emotional manipulation and control that had left no visible scars, but had clearly broken something inside this young woman. "Is that why you bought the gun?" Detective Morgan asked, making a note in his pad. Anna's eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, not just of him, but of what would happen if I tried to stand up to him. He always knew how to make me feel crazy, like everything was my fault." The investigation unfolded like a slow-motion replay of their relationship. Detectives interviewed friends, family members, and coworkers, piecing together the history between Anna and Carlos. Each interview revealed another layer of their complicated dynamic. "He was so charming at first," Anna's sister Elena told the detectives. "We all thought he was perfect for her. But then Anna started changing. She stopped coming to family dinners because Carlos always had some reason why they couldn't make it. She dressed differently, talked differently. It was like watching someone slowly disappear." Carlos's friends painted a different picture. "He loved her," his best friend Marco insisted during his interview. "Sure, they had problems, but who doesn't?" Anna was jealous, always accusing him of things. Carlos just wanted to protect her. The evidence told its own story. The detectives found text messages spanning years, hundreds of them showing patterns of control and manipulation. Carlos questioning Anna's whereabouts, making subtle threats wrapped in expressions of concern, alternating between loving messages and cruel accusations. They found Anna's journal, hidden in her bedroom drawer next to the gun purchase receipt. The entries documented her declining mental state, her growing fear, and finally, her decision to confront Carlos. The last entry was dated the morning of the shooting. "I'm tired of being afraid. Tonight, everything changes." The prosecution team, led by District Attorney Rachel Martinez, built their case methodically. This wasn't self-defense, Martinez argued in her office, surrounded by crime scene photos. She lured him to that park. She brought a gun. This was premeditated. But David Torres saw something different in the evidence. He saw a woman who'd been trapped in a cycle of abuse, who'd finally reached her breaking point. The challenge would be helping the jury see it too. The preliminary hearing brought Anna face to face with Carlos's family for the first time since the shooting. His mother sat in the front row, her face a mask of grief and anger. His younger sister glared at Anna throughout the proceedings, clutching a photo of Carlos to her chest. Anna could barely look at them. These people had welcomed her into their home, treated her like family. Now they sat just feet away, hoping to see her locked away forever. The weight of what she'd done, not just to Carlos, but to everyone who loved him, pressed down on her like a physical force. The evidence photos were the hardest part. Seeing the park where it happened, the blood on the grass, Carlos's body. It made everything real in a way that her memories couldn't. Anna found herself dissociating during these moments, floating somewhere above her body, watching herself react to each new piece of evidence. Her lawyer advised her to show emotion, to help the jury see her humanity. But Anna felt frozen, unable to access her feelings. The only time she broke down was when they showed the text messages, seeing their whole relationship laid out in digital form, the pattern of abuse, so clear now that she could hardly believe she hadn't seen it before. "Look at these messages," Torres said during one of their preparation sessions, spreading printouts across the table. "See how he always turned things around on you? How he'd accuse you of being crazy or oversensitive whenever you tried to stand up for yourself." Anna nodded, running her finger over one particular exchange. Carlos had been angry because she'd gone to lunch with a male colleague. The messages started with him calling her selfish and untrustworthy, then shifted to him saying he only worried because he loved her so much. By the end of the conversation, she'd been apologizing to him. "I just want people to understand," Anna said quietly. "I didn't want to kill him. I just wanted him to hear me, really hear me, for once." Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered on both sides. Some held signs demanding justice for Carlos, painting him as a victim of a scorned woman's revenge. Others supported Anna, their signs speaking to the broader issue of domestic violence and the right to self-defense. The media seized on the story, turning it into a referendum on domestic violence, gun rights, and the limits of self-defense. Every detail of Anna and Carlos's relationship was dissected on morning shows and crime blogs. Everyone had an opinion about what she should have done differently, how she should have handled her fear, why she didn't just walk away. But none of them had lived through it. None of them had felt the slow, insidious way abuse creeps in, how it distorts your reality until you can't trust your own judgment. None of them had stood in that park, facing their abuser, feeling the weight of years of trauma and fear culminate in one devastating moment. As the case moved toward trial, Anna sat in her cell each night, reading letters from other survivors. Women who'd been where she was, who understood the impossible choice between living in fear and fighting back. Their words were both a comfort and a burden, knowing she wasn't alone, but knowing how many others were trapped in the same cycle of abuse she'd tried to escape. The fluorescent lights of the prison meeting room cast harsh shadows across the table where Anna sat with her lawyer. David Torres spread out documents between them, each page representing another piece of the complex puzzle they needed to present to the jury. "The prosecution's going to focus on premeditation," Torres explained, his voice low and steady. "They'll use the gun purchase, the text message, the choice of location. We need to reframe the narrative." Anna nodded, her prison uniform making soft rustling sounds as she leaned forward to examine a transcript. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup. 3 weeks in custody had left their mark, dark circles under her eyes, a pallor to her skin that spoke of sleepless nights and fluorescent lighting. "Tell me about the first time you felt afraid of Carlos," Torres prompted, pen poised over his legal pad. They'd been through this before, but each time Anna remembered something new, another detail that could help the jury understand. "It wasn't one big moment," Anna said, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. "It was little things. He'd get so angry if I didn't answer my phone right away. He'd say things like, 'I drove by your office today,' or 'I saw you talking to that guy at lunch.' Just casual mentions that let me know he was watching." Torres made notes, his handwriting precise and measured. "And when did you start keeping the journal?" "About a year into our relationship. My therapist suggested it." Anna gave a bitter laugh. "Carlos found it once. He read it and then told me I was being dramatic, that I needed help because I was seeing problems where there weren't any. He made me feel crazy for writing down exactly what he was doing to me." The door opened, and Maria walked in, carrying a thick manila envelope. She'd been working tirelessly, gathering evidence and statements from people who'd witnessed Carlos's behavior over the years. As Anna's best friend and now her strongest advocate, she'd become an essential part of the defense team. "I found something," Maria said, pulling out a series of screenshots. "Remember Lisa from Carlos's office?" She finally agreed to talk. She sent these emails from 2 years ago. Carlos was reprimanded at work for aggressive behavior toward female colleagues. Torres examined the emails carefully. This helps establish a pattern. Did she say she'd be willing to testify? Maria nodded. She's scared, but she'll do it. There are other women too from his past. They're starting to come forward. Anna felt a complex mix of emotions. Validation that others had seen Carlos's true nature, guilt that she hadn't spoken up sooner, grief for all the women who'd experienced his abuse. "I should have said something," she whispered. "Maybe if I had." "Stop," Maria said firmly, reaching across the table to squeeze her friend's hand. "You're not responsible for his actions. None of us saw it clearly until it was too late." Torres organized the new documents into his ever-growing file. "We're building a strong case for context. The jury needs to understand that the night in the park didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of years of abuse and fear." They spent hours going through the evidence, preparing Anna for what would come next. The prosecution would try to paint her as calculating and vengeful. They would use her own words against her, the text messages, the journal entries that spoke of anger and revenge. "When they cross-examine you," Torres explained, "they'll try to make you emotional. They want you to look unstable, to confirm their narrative about a woman who couldn't handle rejection. We need you to stay calm, but not cold. Human, but controlled." Anna practiced her responses, trying to find the balance between honesty and composure. How do you explain years of psychological torture without letting the pain overwhelm you? How do you make strangers understand why you couldn't just walk away? "Remember," Torres said, "you're not just defending yourself against a murder charge. You're speaking for every person who's ever felt trapped in an abusive relationship. Your story could help others understand why someone might stay, why they might feel they have no other choice." Outside the prison walls, Maria led a different kind of battle. She organized supporters, coordinated with domestic violence advocacy groups, and managed the growing media interest in Anna's case. Her apartment had become a makeshift command center, walls covered with timelines and witness lists. "We need to be careful about public statements," Torres warned during a strategy session. "Anything we say can be used against us in court, and we don't want to taint the jury pool." But the media narrative was already taking shape, with or without their input. Local news stations ran special reports on domestic violence, featuring experts who dissected Anna and Carlos's relationship. Some portrayed Anna as a calculating killer, others as a desperate survivor. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Dr. Sarah Matthews, a forensic psychologist specializing in domestic violence, joined the defense team as an expert witness. She spent hours with Anna, documenting the psychological impact of Carlos's abuse. "What we're seeing here is classic coercive control," Dr. Matthews explained during a preparation session. "The isolation from friends and family, the constant surveillance, the gaslighting, making her question her own reality. These tactics are as damaging as physical violence, sometimes more so because they're harder to recognize and prove." Anna listened as Dr. Matthews described the patterns in her relationship, putting clinical terms to experiences she'd struggled to explain. Learned helplessness, trauma bonding, hypervigilance. Each term was like a key unlocking another door in her understanding. "But why didn't I see it?" Anna asked during one session. "Why did I keep making excuses for him?" "Abusers don't start with obvious control," Dr. Matthews explained gently. "They start with love, with charm, with seemingly protective behaviors that only gradually become restrictive. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, their sense of reality has been so distorted that they don't trust their own judgment." The defense team also brought in Dr. James Wilson, a ballistics expert who could speak to the physical evidence from the shooting. His analysis of the bullet trajectory and gunpowder residue would be crucial in supporting Anna's account of a struggle. The angle of the entry wound, Dr. Wilson explained, pointing to detailed diagrams, is consistent with someone turning or twisting during a struggle. It doesn't definitively prove self-defense, but it doesn't rule it out either. Meanwhile, Maria worked on humanizing Anna for the potential jury. She collected photos, letters, and testimonials from people who knew Anna before and during her relationship with Carlos. The contrast was striking. Images of a vibrant, confident woman gradually replaced by someone who seemed to be fading into the background. "Look at this," Maria said one day, showing Torres a series of group photos. "You can actually see her shrinking into herself over time. In the later photos, she's always slightly behind Carlos, always looking at him before speaking or smiling. It's like watching someone disappear in slow motion." The prosecution wasn't idle during this time. They built their own narrative, focusing on Anna's gun purchase and the seemingly premeditated nature of the park meeting. They interviewed Carlos's friends and family, collecting stories that painted him as a devoted boyfriend who was trying to move on from a possessive ex-girlfriend. "They're going to bring up your therapy sessions," Torres warned Anna. "The prosecution got access to your records. They'll try to use your discussions about anger and frustration to support their theory of premeditation." Anna felt a fresh wave of violation. Even her private attempts to heal would be used against her. "So, seeking help makes me look guilty? We'll turn it around," Torres assured her. "We'll show that you were actively trying to process your trauma in a healthy way, that you sought help before resorting to violence." As the trial date approached, Anna's support system grew. Other survivors wrote letters sharing their own stories. Domestic violence organizations offered resources and expertise. Even some of Carlos's former colleagues came forward with accounts of his controlling behavior at work. But with each new ally came renewed scrutiny from the prosecution. Each piece of evidence supporting Anna's defense was matched by something that complicated her narrative. The text message asking Carlos to meet. The gun purchased weeks before. The location she chose for their confrontation. "Nothing about this is simple," Torres reminded her. "But that's exactly what we need the jury to understand. The complexity of domestic violence, the way fear and love and trauma can become so tangled that clear decisions become impossible." Anna nodded, looking down at her hands. The same hands that had held the gun, that had written countless journal entries about her fear and pain, that had once loved Carlos enough to believe they could have a future together. "I just hope they can understand," she said quietly. "Not just what happened that night, but everything that led us there." The courthouse steps were crowded on the first day of trial. Anna walked up them flanked by Torres and two deputies, her navy blue dress a deliberate choice to project innocence and professionalism. The click of cameras followed their ascent, reporters calling out questions that blended into white noise. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge Michael Harrison presided over the final pretrial motions. The wood-paneled room felt suffocating despite its high ceilings. Anna sat at the defense table, trying to keep her breathing steady as Carlos's family filed into the benches behind the prosecution. District Attorney Rachel Martinez stood to deliver her opening statement, her red blazer drawing all eyes in the room. "This is a case about premeditation," she began, her voice clear and commanding. "About a woman who couldn't accept that her relationship was over, who lured her ex-boyfriend to a secluded location under false pretenses and executed him in cold blood." Anna watched as Martinez laid out the prosecution's timeline, the gun purchase, the text messages, the chosen location. Each piece of evidence stripped of context, presented as steps in a calculated plan rather than the desperate actions of a terrified woman. When Torres rose to speak, his approach was different. He moved closer to the jury, his voice conversational. "Before you hear about the night Carlos Rivera died, you need to understand the 3 years that led to that moment. You need to understand what it means to love someone who slowly, systematically breaks you down until you don't recognize yourself anymore." The first witness was the responding officer, Sarah Chun. She described finding Anna standing over Carlos's body, the gun still in her hand. "She seemed in shock," Officer Chun testified. "She kept saying he wouldn't listen over and over." Martinez's cross-examination was sharp. Did the defendant appear afraid when you arrived? Was she crying? Showing any signs of having been in a physical struggle? No, Chen admitted. She was very still, almost calm. Torres handled the redirect carefully. In your experience, Officer Chen, how do trauma victims typically behave immediately after a violent incident? There's no typical response, Chen answered. Some cry, some scream, some shut down completely. Shock can look like calm from the outside. The forensics testimony came next. Dr. Wilson explained the bullet trajectory, the gunpowder residue patterns, the physical evidence that suggested a struggle. Martinez challenged each point, highlighting the aspects that could support premeditation instead of self-defense. But it was Maria's testimony that shifted the energy in the courtroom. She took the stand wearing a simple black dress, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she described watching her best friend disappear into an abusive relationship. At first, it was little things, Maria testified. Anna stopped coming to our weekly coffee dates because Carlos said she was spending too much time with friends. She changed her hair, her clothes, everything to match his preferences. She started checking her phone constantly, afraid of missing his calls. Martinez objected repeatedly, calling the testimony prejudicial, but Judge Harrison allowed most of it. The defendant's state of mind and the nature of her relationship with the victim are relevant to this case, he ruled. Maria described finding Anna crying in the work bathroom after Carlos had shown up unannounced at her office, demanding to know why she'd been talking to a male colleague. She recounted the night Anna had called her at 3 a.m., terrified because Carlos was sitting in his car outside her apartment, refusing to leave until she talked to him. Did Ms. Rodriguez ever file a police report? Martinez asked during cross-examination. Did she ever seek a restraining order? No, Maria admitted. She was afraid it would make him angry, and she didn't think anyone would believe her because he never hit her. He was too smart for that. Dr. Sarah Matthews took the stand next, explaining the psychological patterns of coercive control and trauma bonding. She described how victims often become trapped in a cycle of fear and dependency, their reality gradually warped until they can't trust their own judgment. In Ms. Rodriguez's case, Dr. Matthews testified, we see classic signs of gaslighting and emotional manipulation. The victim is gradually isolated from their support system, their confidence undermined, their sense of reality questioned until they become dependent on their abuser's version of events. Martinez's cross-examination was aggressive. Doctor, isn't it true that these same behaviors could be interpreted differently? That what you're calling control could simply be concern? That what you're calling isolation could be a natural part of a couple spending time together? Context is crucial, Dr. Matthews replied firmly. Individual behaviors might seem innocent, but the pattern and impact tell a different story. The prosecution called Carlos's sister, Elena Rivera, to the stand. She painted a different picture of their relationship, Carlos as a devoted boyfriend, Anna as increasingly unstable and possessive. She described family dinners where Anna seemed withdrawn, how she'd snap at Carlos for small things. Did you ever see your brother act violently toward Ms. Rodriguez? Torres asked during cross-examination. No, never, Elena insisted. Carlos wasn't like that. He loved her. Did you ever see him check her phone? Question her about male friends or co-workers. Tell her what to wear. Elena hesitated. He was protective. There's nothing wrong with that. The moment everyone had been waiting for came when Anna took the stand. She'd spent hours preparing with Torres, but nothing could have fully readied her for the weight of all those eyes on her, the heavy silence as she raised her right hand to be sworn in. Torres led her through their prepared testimony carefully. Anna described meeting Carlos, falling in love, and the gradual shift in their relationship. Her voice remained steady as she recounted specific incidents, the time he'd thrown her phone, the nights he'd shown up uninvited, the constant accusations and apologies. Why did you buy the gun? Torres asked. Anna took a deep breath. I was afraid. After we broke up, he kept finding ways to insert himself into my life. I'd see his car outside my apartment, get hang-up calls from unknown numbers. I started having panic attacks, jumping at every sound. The gun made me feel less helpless. And why did you ask him to meet you that night? I thought if I could just make him understand what he'd done to me, maybe the nightmares would stop. Maybe I could finally move on. Anna's voice cracked slightly. I brought the gun because I was afraid of how he'd react. I never wanted to use it. Martinez's cross-examination was brutal. She hammered at every inconsistency, every action that suggested planning rather than fear. If you were so afraid of Mr. Rivera, why meet him in a secluded location? Why not a public place? Why not during daylight hours? I didn't want anyone else around, Anna admitted. I needed him to really listen, not just put on a show like he always did in public. So you lured him to a secluded spot, armed with a gun, because you wanted him to listen? Martinez's tone dripped with skepticism. Isn't it true that you were angry? That you wanted revenge for him moving on with his life while you were still stuck in the past? I wanted closure, Anna insisted, her composure finally cracking. I wanted him to acknowledge what he'd done to me. When he started laughing, dismissing everything like always, saying I was crazy. She paused, tears rolling down her cheeks. He reached for the gun. We struggled. I don't remember pulling the trigger. The courtroom fell silent except for the soft sound of Anna's crying. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking to the jury. She was speaking to every person who'd ever felt trapped, afraid, unheard. Her testimony would either save her or condemn her, and as she stepped down from the witness stand, not even she knew which it would be. During a brief recess after Anna's testimony, Torres found her in the conference room, her hands shaking as she sipped water. The morning's cross-examination had left her drained, but there was something else in her expression, a shift that happened when Martinez had pushed her about wanting revenge. You did well up there, Torres said, sitting across from her. But we need to talk about what happens next. The prosecution's bringing in a surprise witness. Anna looked up sharply. Who? Jenny Martinez. Carlos's ex-girlfriend before you. The name hit Anna like a physical blow. She remembered finding old text messages between Carlos and Jenny early in their relationship, how Carlos had exploded when she asked about them, accusing her of snooping and being paranoid. What's she going to say? Torres spread out some papers on the table. According to the prosecution's filing, she's going to testify about Carlos's behavior in their relationship. She claims he was kind, respectful, never controlling or abusive. The testimony began that afternoon. Jenny Martinez took the stand wearing a conservative black dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. She described a different Carlos than the one Anna had known, someone who encouraged her independence, supported her career, never questioned her male friendships. He was a gentleman, Jenny testified. When we broke up, it was mutual. He even helped me move into my new apartment. Anna watched the jury during Jenny's testimony, saw them taking notes, nodding. This was what a normal breakup looked like, Jenny's presence seemed to say. This was how reasonable people handled the end of a relationship. But during cross-examination, Torres noticed something. Every time he asked Jenny about specific dates or incidents, she would glance at the prosecution table before answering. He changed tactics. Ms. Martinez, did you ever keep a diary during your relationship with Mr. Rivera? Jenny hesitated. No. Are you sure? Because we have here a journal entry from your old blog, dated March 15th, 2018. Torres approached with a printed page. Would you like to read what you wrote? The prosecutor objected, but Judge Harrison allowed it. Jenny's hands trembled as she took the paper. I can't keep doing this, Torres read when Jenny remained silent. Carlos showed up at my work again today. He said he was just bringing me lunch, but I know he was checking on me. He always does this when I don't answer his texts fast enough. The courtroom fell silent. Jenny's composed facade cracked slightly. I forgot about that. It was a long time ago. Did you forget about the restraining order too? Torres asked quietly. The one you filed but dropped a week later? Jenny's face went pale. Behind her, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. They hadn't known about the restraining order. Jenny hadn't told them. He apologized, Jenny whispered. He said he would change. He seemed so sincere. The revelation changed the entire momentum of the trial. Jenny's testimony, intended to damage Anna's credibility, instead reinforced the pattern of behavior Anna had described. More importantly, it showed the jury how convincingly Carlos could present different faces to the world. During the next break, Anna sat with Dr. Matthews, trying to process what they'd learned. "Why didn't she tell me?" Anna asked. "When Carlos and I first got together, I tried to talk to her. She said I was lucky to have him." "Shame," Dr. Matthews explained gently. "Denial. The same reasons you didn't tell anyone at first. It's easier to pretend it never happened than to admit you were victimized." The prosecution tried to recover from Jenny's damaged testimony by shifting focus back to the night of the shooting. They called a park maintenance worker who had been emptying trash cans nearby when he heard the argument. "The woman seemed more aggressive," he testified. "The man was saying something like, 'calm down' or 'take it easy.'" But under cross-examination, the worker admitted he hadn't seen the actual confrontation and that his view had been partially blocked by trees. He also acknowledged that telling someone to calm down could be a form of control rather than genuine concern. The defense team's strategy shifted subtly after Jenny's testimony. Instead of just focusing on Anna's fear, they began highlighting the systemic nature of Carlos's behavior. How he followed the same patterns with different women, how he managed to maintain a respectable public image while privately terrorizing his partners. Maria found more women willing to come forward after Jenny's testimony. Former coworkers, casual dates, each had a story about Carlos's controlling behavior. Most weren't allowed to testify due to legal restrictions, but their statements helped build a clearer picture for the defense team. One afternoon, as Anna reviewed transcripts in her cell, she found herself reading her own words from earlier police interviews. Something clicked as she read her description of the shooting again. "I need to talk to Torres," she told the guard. In the meeting room, Anna spread out the transcripts. "I've been saying it wrong," she explained. "When I talk about the shooting, I keep focusing on making Carlos understand what he did to me. But that's not really why I brought the gun." Torres leaned forward. "Tell me." "I brought it because I knew that if I finally stood up to him, really stood up to him, he would try to hurt me. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I understood for the first time what he was capable of. The gun wasn't about making him listen. It was about surviving the conversation I needed to have." This realization marked a turning point in Anna's case. It wasn't just about fear or revenge. It was about a woman who had finally recognized the true nature of her abuser and taken steps to protect herself while seeking closure. The defense called Dr. Matthews back to the stand to explain this perspective. She testified about how victims often reach a point of clarity about their abuse, and how this recognition can actually increase their danger. "The most dangerous time for a victim is when they finally stand up to their abuser," Dr. Matthews explained. "When the abuser realizes they're losing control, that's when the risk of violence peaks." During a crucial redirect examination, Torres asked Dr. Matthews directly, "In your expert opinion, was Ms. Rodriguez's fear of violence from Mr. Rivera reasonable, given the pattern of behavior she had experienced?" "Not only reasonable, but statistically supported," Dr. Matthews replied. "The progression of control, the response to perceived challenges to that control, everything in their history suggested that a direct confrontation would likely turn violent." The prosecution fought back hard, but their narrative of a scorned woman seeking revenge had been severely undermined. They tried to focus on the technical aspects of the shooting, the angle of the bullet, the number of shots fired, the fact that Carlos was unarmed. But the jury had seen something shift during the trial. Through Jenny's testimony, through Anna's realization, through the expert analysis of Carlos's behavioral patterns, a more complex picture had emerged. The question was no longer just about what happened in the park that night, but about the years of systematic abuse that led them there. As the trial moved toward its final phase, Anna felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever the outcome, she had finally found her voice. She had named her experience, confirmed its reality, and showed others the invisible wounds that emotional abuse leaves behind. In her cell at night, she read letters from other survivors who thanked her for telling their story too. The courtroom buzzed with tension on the day of closing arguments. Every bench was filled, reporters, supporters, Carlos's family, and curious members of the public who'd been following the case. Anna sat at the defense table, wearing the same blue dress she'd worn on the first day of trial, her hands folded tightly in her lap. District Attorney Martinez approached the jury first, her heels clicking against the wooden floor. Ladies and gentlemen, this case might have become complicated with psychology and past relationships, but the facts remain simple. Ana Rodriguez bought a gun. She lured Carlos Rivera to a secluded location. She shot him. Everything else, all this talk about emotional abuse and control, is just smoke and mirrors to distract you from these basic truths. She walked slowly in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. The defense wants you to believe that Ms. Rodriguez was afraid for her life. But look at her actions. She initiated contact. She chose the location. She brought the weapon. These are not the actions of a frightened victim. They are the calculated moves of someone planning revenge. Martinez displayed the text messages on the courtroom screen. "We need to talk. I want to give us another chance." The words seemed to hang in the air. These messages show premeditation. Ms. Rodriguez created a situation where she could confront Mr. Rivera alone, armed, and with the element of surprise. The prosecutor turned to face the jury directly. The defense has painted Carlos Rivera as a monster. They've brought in experts to tell you about abuse patterns and psychological trauma. But remember, Carlos isn't here to defend himself. He can't tell you his side of the story because the defendant made sure of that. The only monster in this story is the woman who executed her ex-boyfriend in cold blood. Torres waited a moment after Martinez sat down, letting the silence settle before he stood. He moved to the center of the courtroom, his manner more conversational than confrontational. "When I first took this case," he began, "I thought it was about a shooting in a park. But as we've learned over these past weeks, that's like saying Romeo and Juliet is about two teenagers who commit suicide. The truth is always more complex." He picked up Anna's journal from the evidence table. "The prosecution wants you to focus on one night, one moment, one action. But to understand that moment, you need to understand the years that led to it. You need to understand what it means to live in fear, not of one explosive act of violence, but of the slow, steady erosion of your sense of self." Torres read from the journal. "Sometimes I wake up and can't remember what I used to be like before Carlos. Did I always check my phone this much? Did I always apologize this much? Did I always feel this afraid?" He turned back to the jury. "The prosecution talks about premeditation. Yes, Ana Rodriguez bought a gun. Yes, she asked Carlos to meet her. Yes, she chose a location where they could talk privately. But let's talk about why. Let's talk about what it means to finally stand up to someone who has spent years making you feel powerless." Walking closer to the jury box, Torres lowered his voice. "Ask yourselves, what would you do if you knew you had to confront someone who had systematically destroyed your sense of safety? Someone who had shown up uninvited at your home, your workplace? Someone who had isolated you from friends and family, who had made you question your own sanity. Would you go unprotected?" Torres continued, his voice gaining strength. "The prosecution wants you to see Ana Rodriguez as calculating. I want you to see her as clear-sighted. After years of manipulation and fear, she finally understood exactly who Carlos Rivera was and what he was capable of. She didn't bring a gun that night because she wanted to kill him. She brought it because she knew that truly standing up to him, really making him hear her, might be dangerous." He walked over to the evidence table and picked up the crime scene photos. "The prosecution says Carlos was turning away when he was shot. The defense experts showed you how that same evidence could support a struggle for the gun. But ask yourselves this: if Ana Rodriguez wanted to kill Carlos Rivera, why meet him face to face? Why try to talk first? Why not shoot him the moment he arrived?" The answer hung in the air as Torres returned to his seat. Ana could feel the jury's eyes on her, trying to reconcile the different versions of her they'd been presented with: victim or villain, defender or executioner. Judge Harrison instructed the jury on the law, explaining the differences between first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, and self-defense. His voice was steady and neutral as he outlined each legal standard, but Anna could barely focus on the words. Everything seemed to be happening very far away. The jury retired to deliberate late that afternoon. Anna was taken back to her cell, where she sat on her narrow bed, trying not to think about 12 strangers deciding her fate. Maria visited, bringing fresh clothes for the verdict and news from the courthouse. "People are talking about the case everywhere," Maria said. It started conversations about emotional abuse, about self-defense, about how the system handles domestic violence. Hours stretched into days. The jury sent out questions about the legal definitions of premeditation and self-defense. They requested transcripts of Jenny Martinez's testimony and Dr. Matthews' expert analysis. Each note from the jury room sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Anna's body. On the fourth day of deliberations, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Anna changed into her court clothes with trembling hands. Torres met her outside the courtroom. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "you've already changed how people think about domestic violence. You've given other survivors a voice." The courtroom was packed as Judge Harrison took the bench. Anna stood with Torres as the jury filed in, their faces impossible to read. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the clerk. "In the matter of the state versus Ana Rodriguez, on the charge of first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant not guilty." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Anna swayed slightly, feeling Torres's steadying hand on her arm. "On the charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The tension in the room was palpable. "On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty." The words seemed to echo in the silent courtroom.
Guilty.
Not of murder, but of a lesser charge that acknowledged the heat of passion, the complex circumstances that led to Carlos's death. Behind her, Anna could hear Carlos's mother crying softly. When she was finally allowed to speak at her sentencing hearing, Anna addressed the court in a clear, steady voice. "I take responsibility for Carlos's death. Not for defending myself, but for letting it come to that. For not getting help sooner. For not speaking up when I saw him starting the same patterns with other women. His death will haunt me forever, but I hope my story helps someone else find their voice before it's too late." Judge Harrison sentenced her to 8 years, less than the maximum for voluntary manslaughter. He acknowledged the years of abuse she'd suffered while emphasizing that taking a life warranted serious punishment. As she was led from the courtroom, Anna caught a glimpse of Jenny Martinez in the gallery. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, Anna saw something like understanding pass between them. Two women who had survived the same storm, even if they'd reached different shores. The Central California Women's Facility looked nothing like the prisons Anna had seen on TV. The buildings were low and sprawling, surrounded by carefully maintained grass that somehow stayed green despite the valley heat. After 3 months, she'd learned to navigate its rhythms, the daily count, the work assignments, the carefully scheduled visits that kept her connected to the outside world. Anna found her place in the prison's domestic violence support group, which met every Wednesday in a fluorescent-lit room that smelled of industrial cleaner. The women sat in a circle of plastic chairs, sharing stories that echoed with familiar patterns of control, fear, and ultimately, resistance. "I never thought I'd end up here," Anna told the group during one session. "I spent so many years trying to be perfect, trying to avoid making him angry. Now I'm in prison, and somehow I feel more free than I did then." The group facilitator, a woman named Grace who'd been where they were 20 years ago, nodded in understanding. "Freedom isn't always what we think it is," she said. "Sometimes it's just being able to tell your truth, even if people don't want to hear it." Maria visited every weekend, bringing news from the outside world. Anna's case had sparked conversations about emotional abuse and self-defense laws. Support groups cited her story when discussing the invisible scars of psychological abuse. Law schools used her trial transcripts to teach about the complexity of domestic violence cases. "Your story is helping people," Maria told her during one visit. "Women are coming forward, seeking help before things escalate. Men are recognizing their own controlling behaviors and getting counseling." Anna started receiving letters from strangers, other survivors who saw their own experiences reflected in her story. She read each one carefully, responding when she could, saving them all in a folder that grew thicker each week. One letter stood out. It was from Jenny Martinez, Carlos's ex-girlfriend who had testified at the trial. "I've been in therapy," Jenny wrote. "Finally dealing with what happened between Carlos and me. Your trial made me face things I'd been denying for years. I'm sorry I wasn't honest sooner. Maybe if I had been, things would have ended differently." During her first year in prison, Anna worked with her therapist to understand not just what had happened with Carlos, but the patterns in her own life that had made her vulnerable to his manipulation. She traced it back to her childhood, to a father whose approval was always just out of reach, to a mother who taught her that keeping the peace was more important than speaking her truth. "We repeat what we don't repair," her therapist said. "But you're doing the repair work now. That's what matters." In her second year, Anna started working in the prison library. She organized a collection of resources about domestic violence, creating a space where other inmates could find information and support. The library became a sanctuary of sorts, a place where women could explore their own stories through books and quiet reflection. Carlos's family had moved away from Los Angeles, but his sister Elena reached out through their lawyer.
She wanted to understand, she said.
The trial had made her question things she'd seen but dismissed during Carlos's relationship with Anna. They began exchanging letters, careful at first, then more open as they shared their different perspectives on the man they'd both loved. "I still miss him," Anna wrote to Elena. "Not the person he became, but the person I thought he was at the beginning. I think part of healing is learning to hold both truths, that someone could make you feel so loved and so afraid at the same time." The foundation that Carlos's family had established evolved over time. What started as a memorial to their son became an organization dedicated to preventing relationship violence through education and early intervention. They worked with schools and community groups, teaching young people about healthy relationships and the warning signs of abuse. Anna's case became a milestone in legal circles. Law professors used it to discuss the limitations of traditional self-defense doctrine when applied to cases of long-term emotional abuse. Some states began considering legislation to expand their self-defense laws to better account for psychological abuse and coercive control. During her fourth year, Anna started mentoring younger inmates, particularly those who had survived abusive relationships. She shared her story not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that survival took many forms, that strength could be found even in the darkest moments. "The hardest part," she told one young woman, "isn't admitting what happened to you. It's admitting what you did in response. But you can't heal if you're not honest about both." Maria kept Anna updated about their old friends, about changes in the neighborhood, about life moving forward outside the prison walls. Some friends had drifted away after the trial, uncomfortable with the complexity of Anna's story. Others had drawn closer, understanding that support meant accepting the messy truth rather than a simple narrative of victim and villain. In her journal, a new one, started the day she entered prison, Anna wrote about her hopes for the future. She would be eligible for parole in a few more years. The world had changed since her conviction. Conversations about domestic violence had evolved, understanding had deepened, but there was still so much work to be done. She thought often about the night in the park, not to relive the trauma, but to understand it. Each time she revisited the memory, she saw it differently. Not just the fear and anger that had driven her actions, but the deeper currents of systemic failure that had left her feeling that a gun was her only protection. The women in her support group understood. They talked about the times they'd tried to get help, how their fears had been dismissed, how the system had failed to protect them until it was too late. Together, they worked to transform their pain into purpose, their regret into resolve. As Anna approached her 5th year in prison, she received news that Carlos's foundation was launching a new initiative focused on rehabilitation and support for survivors who had fought back against their abusers. They wanted her input, her perspective on what might have helped her find a different path. "Your story matters," Grace told her during group one day. "Not just the parts about being a victim, not just the parts about what you did, but all of it. The messy, complicated truth of how love becomes fear, how fear becomes desperation, how desperation leads us places we never thought we'd go." That's the story people need to hear. Anna looked around the circle at the women who had become her community, each carrying their own version of the same story. She thought about all the letters in her folder, all the voices finally speaking their truth. Something had shifted, not just in her, but in the larger conversation about domestic violence and justice. She opened her journal and began to write. This isn't where my story ends. It's where a new one begins.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.